So right after the Civil War, a bunch of companies, many of whom had profited on the war, because war always, creates a lot of business. They've got to create tanks and ammunition and food for soldiers. Anyway, so after the Civil War, uh, these companies that had grown strong during the wartime began to create what were called trusts, which were in essence uh, at first like loose partnerships of companies, and then in time where they weren't loose partnerships, they were actually owned by the same people of companies that would own huge chunks of industry. So like all of the railroads in a large geographical area, or all of the food production, or things like that. So these trusts started appearing after the Civil War. And so the government's response to these trusts was to create the Sherman Antitrust Act in 1890. So we'll talk about each of these just super briefly. But in essence, um, as these trusts formed and competition was reduced, because in essence, if you own so much of the industry in an area, you can kind of push out your competitors just by say lowering your price until everybody buys from you, until your competitors go out of business, and then raising your price back up. So the government's response were these 4 laws spread out over the next 50 years or so. So the first is the Sherman Antitrust Act in 1890, and in essence, that outlawed what it called it outlawed trusts, okay, and any conspiracy to restrain trade. That was all made illegal. And then in 1911, the Supreme Court limited the reach of the act to just say unreasonable restraints on trade. So in essence, the Sherman Act of 1890 outlawed monopolies, or building these companies that would control large swaths of industry. And then in 1911, the Supreme Court clarified to say, well, only unreasonable restraints. Sometimes some restraints on trade are reasonable given certain market needs and so forth. In 1976, Congress made any violation of the Sherman Act a felony rather than a misdemeanor. Then in 1914, the Clayton Act was passed, which just sort of extended some of these laws to protect competition. And specifically, the Clayton Act forbade discrimination in price. So you can't charge different purchasers for the same commodities a different price, and you can't put conditions on the sale of the things that you're selling. In other words, what people were doing is they'd say, okay, we don't have a trust anymore, and then they would only sell their goods to, say, as a supplier, they'd only sell to one seller, one retailer, which in essence, again, created a trust, or created this sort of protected line of business. So the Clayton Act made that illegal. And also it would allow a single person to only serve on the board of one company if the companies were competitors. You couldn't serve on the boards of, say, 2 competing companies. And then in 1914, they also created the Federal Trade Commission Act, which prohibits unfair methods of competition, which is kind of exactly what the Clayton Act did, and deceptive acts of practice in commerce, or practices in commerce. But what it really did is it created the Federal Trade Commission. So this was an enabling act to create the enforcement agency for this issue. So the Federal Trade Commission Act of 1914 created what we still have today as the Federal Trade Commission. Finally, the Robinson-Patman Act in 1936, it more specifically forbade price discrimination, but it's still not popular with anybody, either on the business side or the government side, because the language isn't clear. The Congress, not the Congress, the Supreme Court has struggled to rule on it because it's just not clear exactly what the intent of Congress was. So these are the 4 big laws. We don't have to be experts in them. We just need to know that they exist: the Sherman Antitrust Act, the Clayton Act, the Federal Trade Commission Act, and then the Robinson-Patman Act. So the vast majority of anti-competitive behavior that we see is still prosecuted under these 4 laws today.